Pokémon is best known for their main series games, but between the release of those, people like me go absolutely feral for any more Pokémon content, which led to the development of Pokémon spin-offs. Some are iconic and incredible, and others are, well, whatever this is.
It's Pikachu as a cop!
So today we're looking at Pokémon spin-offs for the 3DS to see if they're really that bad. And it all started with Pokémon Rumble Blast, which released on October 24th, 2011 in North America, August 11th, 2011 in Japan, December 2nd, 2011 in Europe, and December 8th, 2011 in Australia. For some reason, Pokémon Rumble is a series that a lot of people don't talk about. I'm not saying these games are perfect, but for a simple game, they are a pretty good time. This was the first Pokémon game that was created for the 3DS. The first Pokémon Rumble came out in 2009 for the Wii, and as a sequel, Blast did a pretty good job. In the Rumble games, you play as toy Pokémon, and unlike other spin-off games like Mystery Dungeon and even Pokémon Ranger, this is far less narratively driven and more of an arcade beat-em-up game. That's not to say this doesn't have a story, but it's nowhere near as flushed out as other titles. It takes place in the world of Toyland, where all of the light springs are drying up, and it's your job to figure that one out. And it turns out the Cobalion has been stealing them all, and it's your job to get them all back and return them to where they belong. Now, it's no Godfather, but at least it has a story, unlike the first game on the Wii. Unlike a typical Pokemon game, this has real-time combat. It's not a fancy version of rock, paper, scissors, it's more so a fight to the death. Another upgrade from the original is that you have Pokemon up through Generation 5. And in total, there are 646 different Pokemon you can play as in this game. And that is not a bad selection at all. They easily could have limited the amount of Pokemon you could play as, but they ended up giving us a ton of different options, which is really nice to see. But if you were done with the story mode and you wanted more things to do, there were other options for you. They brought back the Battle Royale mode from the original, where you choose up to 3 Pokemon and you fight in a gauntlet and the last one standing wins. They throw a ton of Pokemon at you, and once you defeat all of them, they'll give you even more Pokemon to fight, and if you can defeat all of the Pokemon, you get a good amount of coins. There was the new Team Battle, where in this game mode, you'll control 3 Pokemon at the same time.
I can't do it, it's too much.
You'll fight through different waves of Pokemon until you fight a boss, and honestly, it's pretty much the same game mode as Battle Royale, but this time you could have 3 Pokemon stack on top of each other, and at that point, all they need is a trench coat and they'll look like they're trying to sneak into an R-rated movie. There was another new mode called Charge Battle, where this time you control a group of Pokemon, and you'll fight another group of Pokemon, and the goal is to chain together combos, and absorb as many Pokemon into your army as possible. And lastly, there were Street Pass battles, but in order to play them, it required a few things. One, you'd have to bring your 3DS with this game out and about, which is pretty easy, but the second part required someone else to own this game and also bring their 3DS out and about, which is why I've literally never been able to try this game mode. Now, is Rumble Blast the best game ever? No, but that doesn't mean it's bad. For an arcade-style beat-em-up game, it was pretty great. But if you go in expecting more than that, you're gonna be disappointed. The game can get very repetitive, and if that bothers you, you might not like it. And there really wasn't a lot of depth to the game, but if you're looking for an easy and fun game to play, this is not a bad choice at all. And at least this was a game, unlike the next title, Pokédex 3D, which released on June 6, 2011 in North America, June 17th, 2011 in Japan, and June 7th, 2011 in Europe and in Australia. Pokédex 3D is exactly what it sounds like. A 3D Pokédex app for the 3DS. And if that's interesting to you, that's awesome. But to me, this is just a waste of download space. There is really no gameplay here at all, and I get that it's not supposed to be a game, and it was more so a free informational accessory, but even if that's the case, it still has a load of problems. During the early days of the 3DS's lifespan, they had a huge focus on augmented reality, which in theory is a pretty cool idea. But Pokédex 3D wasn't really the best way to do it. In the beginning, you would only have 16 Pokemon, which was cool, but unlocking new Pokemon was really a hassle. There were a few ways to get new Pokemon like QR codes, Spot Pass, and getting them through friends. And I get this was supposed to function like a normal Pokédex, but if it's gonna be a boring informational app, at least give me all of the information off the go. And that did end up happening with Pokédex 3D Pro, which is a much better version of this, but it's still not that great. The Pro version was no longer free, but it was a much better version. It included all Pokemon from previous generations, and most of the Pokemon from Generation 5, and you didn't have to unlock them through some weird means, they were all included right off the rip. Luckily, all of the renderings of the Pokemon look incredible. I mean, look at Bellsprout, he's already perfect, but now he's even more perfect. But this was not really a game, and it wasn't extremely popular because if I wanted to learn something about a Pokemon, I would just Google it.
Vaporeon can do what?
But if you're a fan of Pokemon, it was a neat little accessory to have. And the next game was a little bit better than this, but not by much. With Pokemon Dream Radar, which released on October 7th, 2012 in North America, June 23rd, 2012 in Japan, October 12th, 2012 in Europe, and October 11th, 2012 in Australia. Like I said before, augmented reality was extremely popular in the early days of the 3DS. And in this case, I think it worked pretty well. Pokemon Dream Radar tied directly in with Pokemon Black and White 2. The game has you shooting clouds and catching Pokemon, which you could then transfer directly to your Black and White 2. And I'll be honest, it was a pretty cool idea. I only played this a handful of times, and it was only to get the Therian forms of Tornadus, Landorus, and Thundurus. But it was an extremely simple game. You shoot clouds, collect Pokemon, and send them to the main game. If you were looking for anything more than that, you were gonna be disappointed, but it was at least a good time. But after this, we finally got a traditional Pokemon spin-off game, and that was Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity, which released on March 24th, 2013 in North America, November 23rd, 2012 in Japan, May 17th, 2013 in Europe, and May 18th, 2013 in Australia. The Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series is one of my favorite Pokemon spin-offs of all time. This was the fourth game in that series, and it did things that were a little bit different. It was the first time a Mystery Dungeon game went into full 3D, and it allowed Gen 5 Pokemon for the first time. It starts off like most Mystery Dungeon games where you wake up as a Pokemon. You get to choose between a few different Pokemon, and you meet your partner Pokemon, and together you have a goal to create a Pokemon paradise. But while you're trying to do that, the legendary Pokemon Kyurem and the Bitter Cold, which looks terrifying, try and stop you, and you have to navigate different dungeons in a roguelite adventure that is pretty solid overall. And I will say this is my least favorite of the Mystery Dungeon games, but I don't think it's that bad. Just comparatively, it's not very good. The Mystery Dungeon games aren't really complicated, but they always have an incredible story. And this story was fine. It was really simple and kind of bland, especially coming from Explorers of Sky, which for a load of reasons is the best Mystery Dungeon game. So even though this game did a lot to bring the series into a more modern feel, it also changed a lot of things that people loved about the series to begin with. In other Mystery Dungeon titles, there were a lot more choices when it comes to Pokemon you can play as, where in Gates to Infinity, you could only pick one of 5 Pokemon. And in every sense of the term, that is just a downgrade. Roguelite games are supposed to be extremely replayable, and limiting the amount of Pokemon you can play as just does not make sense to me. They also cut the amount of recruitable Pokemon down to 144, which is another downgrade and makes this game less replayable than any game in the series prior. I'm not gonna sit here and say this is a bad game, but compared to every other game in the series, it just is not as good. And for some reason, they felt the need to add augmented reality into this game as well, where if you point your 3DS at circles, it gives you different dungeons to explore. And honestly, I don't think that's a bad use of this, but I would rather just have those dungeons in the game already instead of having to add an extra step to access them. I get that augmented reality was the talk of the town at the time, but I don't want to have to search through my couch cushions for a quarter in order to play this game more. This was also the first Pokemon game ever to include DLC. Both paid and free DLC were available, which mostly made it easier to access rarer Pokemon and items. So not only was this not necessary, they also paywalled part of the game, which makes me think this game overall was just not that great. And unless I'm specifically looking to play this game, I'm never gonna pick this over any of the other Mystery Dungeon games. And if you're not a fan of Mystery Dungeon games or stories, the next game, Pokemon Battle Trozei, might be a little more your speed, which released on March 20th, 2014 in North America, March 12th, 2014 in Japan, March 13th, 2014 in Europe, and March 14th, 2014 in Australia. The Pokemon Trozei games are pretty solid. It's a simple puzzle game where you match faces of Pokemon together, and during the early and mid 2010s, games like Candy Crush and every diet flavor of that were everywhere, so making a Pokemon version just made sense. If you're looking for a fun puzzle game to play, this is a good time. There really isn't a lot of story here, it's mostly just playing a puzzle game. It features the first 718 Pokemon. You move them around on the touchscreen and you connect their faces together. The more you connect, the more points you get, with the goal of beating whatever level you're on. It's a puzzle game, it doesn't need to be super complicated, but it's at least the best Pokemon puzzle game on this console, and it's by a pretty large margin because everything is included when you buy the game. There are 10 main zones in the game, with 3 extra bonus zones. And you might be thinking, why should I get this over the original Pokemon Trozei? And unless you're looking to play multiplayer, I don't have a great answer for you. It has Street Pass connectivity, but considering nobody is walking around with their 3DS anymore, it's hard to play this game with someone.
Hey, what do you mean nobody?
If you're a fan of puzzle games like I am, you're gonna enjoy this. But if you're not really, or you already have the original Trozei, I can't say this is at all worth it. But if you're looking for another story-driven game, you should probably look somewhere else because the next game is Pokémon Art Academy, which released on October 24th, 2014 in North America, June 19th, 2014 in Japan, July 4th, 2014 in Europe, and July 5th, 2014 in Australia. To give credit where credit's due, Pokémon Art Academy is a very unique game, and it works incredibly well. Art Academy is an educational art game which was made to teach people how to draw different Pokemon, and honestly, I played this game a lot more than I'd like to admit. I am not a good artist at all, but this at least gave me the ability to draw Pokemon to a minor capacity. It comes with a load of different tools and it teaches you how to draw a bunch of different Pokemon. There were a few different ways to play. You had your lesson mode which brought you step by step how to draw these Pokemon, and you had a free paint mode which let you do whatever you wanted in whatever order you wanted. There was a quick sketch mode which allowed you to practice on simple tutorials, and you had a gallery where you could save all of your different artwork. And honestly, I think this is one of the most underrated Pokemon spin-offs of all time. Now, this is a very niche game, and honestly, I didn't think I was going to like it at all, because I am not artistic. But if you want something fun and simple to pass the time, it is very good and educational, and honestly, it's hard to do both those things well. My only real critique is that I wish there were more Pokemon and a better way to export your drawings so you could keep them forever. But if you're a fan of drawing or you just want something to kill the time, I absolutely recommend getting this. Pokémon Shuffle released on February 18th, 2015 worldwide. Now looking at Pokémon Shuffle, you might think exactly what I think.
I've seen this before, right?
I was surprised to find out that there was not one, but two separate Pokemon matching puzzle series available on the 3DS. Pokémon Shuffle is an enhanced version of Pokémon Shuffle Mobile, and it's another Pokemon matching puzzle game, but this time it's a little more strategic than the others. They have made a lot of different Pokemon puzzle games, from Pokemon Puzzle League all the way to this, and I'm not gonna sit here and say this is bad, but I think they're beating a dead horse at this point. They should just stick with one of these series and make all of these other options a different game mode. But if you're a fan of these, I can't say this is a bad time. Unlike Pokemon Trozei, your goal is to match groups of 3 to create combos. You have a limited number of moves, so you need to think about the best combo before you do it. This time, however, there are type advantages and mega evolutions that will help you out. But the biggest issue with this game is that it's a freemium game. Similar to games like Candy Crush, you're gonna have to wait in order to play it again, so you can either buy hearts with real money or wait 30 minutes to play another round. And that is something that I just can't get behind. I am fine when DLCs give content to the players. In a lot of cases, I am willing to pay extra money to get more content for the games that I love. But when a game is made in order to drain every single dollar out of their players possible, I can't stand behind that. There's a reason you've never seen me do a sponsored video for a mobile game, or at all at this point, and it's because I don't believe this is good for the consumer or for the gaming industry as a whole. Playing the game is a pretty good time, but considering the gross monetization practices, I can't say it's worth checking out. But luckily the next game is a little bit better, but it still has some of the same issues, and that's Pokémon Rumble World, which released April 29th, 2016 in North America, November 19th, 2015 in Japan, January 22nd, 2016 in Europe, and January 23rd, 2016 in Australia. Rumble World is the 4th game in the Pokémon Rumble series, following right behind Pokémon Rumble U, which released for the Wii U.
Wow, who would have guessed?
Yeah, sometimes Nintendo doesn't have the most creative names. I really love the Pokemon Rumble games, but unfortunately, just like Pokemon Shuffle, this is another free-to-play title, which means they were trying to milk every single dollar out of anyone who played. I'm not gonna sit here and defend the way they monetize these games, because I would rather pay $40 up front and then not have to pay money over time. But luckily, they ended up doing just that. And they released a physical copy of this game with all of the microtransactions already unlocked. And that's a way that I can kind of get behind freemium games. If there's a free version that you don't technically need to pay for, and then a paid version that you don't have to drop any more money, I can see the benefits for some people. Now, personally, I just bought the physical copy and I never ran out of the in-game currency they gave me because I was earning it in-game before I was using it. But that also could be because I didn't play this game as much as as I played the other games. Gameplay-wise, it feels just like a Pokemon Rumble game. It takes place in the Kingdom of Toys, and you adventure around beating up Pokemon in a fast-paced action combat game that's pretty fun. It included every single Pokemon from Generation 6 and back, including all of the Megas from X and Y and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, but I didn't really play this game as much as the rest. Maybe it was the fact that it came out at a weird time, and I can't lie, I was put off from the freemium model at first, but I'm gonna hit Pokemon Rumble World with a "it's fine" out of 10. But the next game was a return to form for the Mystery Dungeon series with Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon, which released on November 20th, 2015 in North America, September 17th, 2015 in Japan, February 19th, 2016 in Europe, and February 20th, 2016 in Australia. While Gates to Infinity was a fine game, a lot of people who loved the Mystery Dungeon series didn't really like that game because it changed too much. So Pokemon and Nintendo did what they do best, and made a game that was a return to form and slapped the word Super right on the title. Unlike Gates to Infinity, you now had the choice of one of 20 separate Pokemon. You had all of the starters from the first 6 generations, plus Riolu and Pikachu. But no matter how many letters I've written to the Pokemon Company, they for some reason won't let Bellsprout be a starter.
How do you spell prejudice?
Like every other Mystery Dungeon game, you wake up as a Pokemon. You meet your partner who dreams of joining the Expedition Society, and you end up going on a journey that's far bigger than anything in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon history. Your goal is to save the Tree of Life from dark matter, but as weird as that sounds, it works pretty well. And my only real complaint about the story of this game is that they were throwing legendaries at you left and right. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but a lot of the older Mystery Dungeon games focused on more obscure Pokemon. And I like they were giving these Pokemon a time to shine. And there were legendaries in those older games, but when you ran into them, it felt like a climactic moment. And having legendary and mythical Pokemon around every corner kind of got rid of the magic of seeing them in the game. There still is a load of regular Pokemon that you'll encounter, and in fact, most of them are normal, but there are a lot more legendaries this time around than there were in the older titles. And I just love interacting with Pokemon that I might not use in a standard Pokemon game or playthrough. But compared to Gates to Infinity, this is a overall upgrade in every possible way. The graphics are just as good, if not better. The gameplay feels more like the older titles, with some changes to make it feel distinct. And though I can't put it as the #1 best Mystery Dungeon game, I will say it's probably the best Pokemon spin-off we got on the 3DS. If you're a fan of the Mystery Dungeon series, you're doing yourself a disservice by not playing this. But the next game is another freemium Pokemon puzzle game that I do kind of enjoy, with Pokemon Picross, which released on December 3rd, 2015 in North America and Europe, December 2nd, 2015 in Japan, and December 4th, 2015 in Australia. There have been a lot of Picross games throughout history, featuring franchises like Mario and Zelda, so it only made sense for Pokemon to get the same treatment. And it would have happened a long time ago with the unreleased Game Boy Color game, but we ended up having to wait until the 3DS came out to get a full Pokemon Picross game. And again, I like it, but I don't like that they're trying to bleed people for their money. It's a Picross game, so there are numbers around the board, which you use to determine which sections you will and will not fill in. And once you complete a puzzle, you end up getting rewarded with a Pokemon. Of course, the Pokemon are going to have types, and those types will affect the game in some way. So if you're a fan of Picross games, there's a lot to love about this. And for it being a free game, there's a good amount of content. However, just because I like Picross doesn't mean that I'm gonna give this a pass. The game has its own freemium currency called Picrites. You need these to do pretty much everything in the game, and you can unlock them by playing, but of course it's so much easier to just buy them. And I get it, it's a free game, they have to make their money somehow, but they should just sell the game for $5 or $10 and they would make that money. And I understand that people like me would play this game and never spend $1. But a lot of people drop an absurd amount of money on a game that's free and not realize they're doing it. And structuring your game to make money as opposed to being a fun game to play just doesn't seem right to me. And I like Picross, and if you do too, you would probably like this game, but I don't recommend it for 2 reasons. 1, because it's freemium, and 2, because you just can't get it anymore because the shop's closed. So even if you wanted to play it, it's very hard to do so. But even though I don't agree with how they monetized a lot of these games, the fact that they were free and you didn't technically need to spend any money on them was a decent idea to a point. But the last Pokemon spin-off game that came out for the 3DS came out a few years later, and that was Detective Pikachu, which released worldwide on March 23rd, 2018. Remember Detective Pikachu? That movie that had the Mr. Mime that made me lose sleep for a week? Yeah, so do I, because they made a video game about it. There was a shorter, download-only version of this game in Japan in 2016. The video game came out before the movie, and I'm not going to be one of those people who says the video game is better than the movie, because they're both different. This is an adventure puzzle-solving game where you play as Tim Goodman, who works alongside Detective Pikachu. You walk around, talk to people, find clues, and solve mysteries. It's like Scooby-Doo if there was less masks and more electricity. Now, gameplay-wise, there is not a lot to this. It's really not the most interactive game you'll ever play, but what it does have is a pretty good story. I like to compare this to anything made by Telltale Games, where you're really not playing it for the gameplay itself, more so the story the game tells. So if you're looking for something more engaging to play, then this might not be for you. But if you want a very unique Pokemon story, this is a good change of pace. And as much as I would love to talk about this game more, it's all story and I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who might pick this up. So just know going in, don't expect too much in terms of great gameplay, just expect a story that's pretty solid all the way through. But outside of the main 3DS releases, the Virtual Console offered a couple different games. From the Game Boy Color, like Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, Pokemon Pinball, and Pokemon Trading Card Game, which was a nostalgic throwback and honestly makes me miss the Virtual Console now more than ever. But the 3DS had a pretty wide selection of Pokemon spin-offs, some of which were really fun and others were, well...
Give me all your money! I can't, you took all of it yesterday.
But what's your favorite Pokemon spin-off series? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching. I hope that you and your family have an incredible rest of your day, and if you like anything that you saw here, please consider subscribing.